Hello everyone, today we talk about the Napoleonic idea of battle. Napoleonic in the sense of the Napoleonic era, not just Napoleon, in spite of definitely his massive contribution to the development of the art of war in that time in history. And I made a video about that exactly a couple of years ago for the 200th anniversary of his death. I may be re-uploading it at some point with improved images, but the audio and the actual content in this sense is, as you know, always available. We have abundantly seen through the Vom Kriege series how much this stepping up, right, of the scale of warfare was true in this era. We made also some videos, including recently, about the passage from, say, the Ancien regime to the nation state, and the the mechanisms, of course, that were in place politically and socially to produce that dramatic military change, within which we still are, technically, as we are still within the nation state by a degree, and also by the sheer scale of troops involved ever since, aside from naturally the important changes in the art of war that, however, do not really change what war gets down to, essentially. So, in other words, we observed armies increasing from essentially the tens to the hundreds of thousands, right, on a regular basis, with dramatic changes even in what had been properly the capacity of maintaining them on the field. At the time, Napoleonic era, the armies were so large that essentially there was no supply system standing, right, aside from the fact the resupplying of some kind of irreplaceable elements in loco, such as artillery and part of cavalry and so on, but that in fact were meant to be constantly on the move like locusts, because there was essentially no way to maintain them locally for more than some days, right? So this speeded up dramatically also the entire political and strategic situation. Naturally, there was behind this a dramatic improvement also in the quality, in the collective training that only a state can provide, a state of that, in fact, absolute, truly absolute, because it's ironic that we call absolute monarchies the ones from the Ancien regime that, by definition, were not absolute, whereas, from the Code Napoleon onwards, you do literally have the fact that the state is the sole source of law, and this is essentially reflected in the military sphere, with an army that is not someone else's army, but it's the state's army, and it can mobilize literally everyone just because the state says so. Naturally, the state is the same country, so people were phobic about this kind of turn of the civilizational events that is still actually traditionally consequential, because it actually increased power dramatically, and it reflects the political cohesion that can provide with these means in the first place. Also equates to a dramatic qualitative increase, meaning that armies basically get split in divisions that are sort of mini armies, fully and tactically complete, that fundamentally are part of this major wall that can articulate itself like a blob, and having, however, in its various elements kind of the same character, the same quantities, the same quality of any other part of the army. Naturally, things are, say, a bit more complex, because there were some corps, some other, say, elite elements, coalition armies, but in terms, say, of sheer mass and power, right, the divisions were fundamentally interchangeable, and this brought literally to a, given the size of the armies, right, to a scientific realization of, for example, how long could a division hold the ground under a certain amount of pressure, because you would know, for example, that a division, even under, in the worst, in dire straits, could not be wiped out before a certain amount of hours, right? To make the example. So you had that specific time at least available for carrying out some other maneuvers, naturally bringing in the reserves there. And so, as we will see now, that there is this continuously attritional mass warfare that was very different from what had been existing in the Ancien regime, with essentially smaller armies that were also much more exposed. Like, first of all, they were smaller, right? So they were the same states made overall, say, in absolute terms, less efforts. There was an incredible importance attached to maneuvering, kind of cutting supply lines, especially in the second half of the 18th century, in the 7 Years' War, right? If you study, the Austrian or Prussian military history, the Silesian campaigns, etc., you have there properly a school of these strategies and tactics, because essentially theaters were relying fundamentally on just that army, right? That was meant to be engaged in what still resembled as a there were large armies, sometimes several tens of thousands of troops, but fundamentally they engaged still in a linear array, right? There were reserves, of course, there were wings, etc., but in this sense, it's not like it would be in Napoleonic times, where you have actually several of these armies by size that are actually packed together, and there's not really a real linear order in that. There's just an area where you can keep pouring in these armies and knowing what they're going to perform there. So this is an incredibly important, of course, step forward in the art of war. Essentially, mankind had never been able to produce anything like that before. The Napoleonic Wars were the most devastating ones ever fought historically up to that point. And naturally, there are major implications that we have seen, again, politically, scientifically, philosophically. That's why I have von Clausewitz's avatar, by the way, identify in this specific moment in history essentially the moment of essentially greatest balance between tradition and modernity, right, in civilizationally speaking. And so some of the highest expression of human civilization ever. And I'm not going to descend on kind of the broader, in fact, implications of this, but just making you reflect, as we have seen already in the von Clausewitz series, how much this, of course, state of affairs was coming to be from naturally a political, but also in strictly military terms, strategic, etc., but also theoretical and doctrinal point of view. That is to say, at some point, the military, the world in general, began to realize that this was the new world, right? And it took a lot to understand this. I mean, the entire Napoleonic Wars are the proof of that. Last autumn, I made videos about, specifically a mini-series about the Austerlitz campaign. That is, as you know, basically the strategic and tactical peak of the French Imperial Army, and that well exemplifies essentially the level of development that the French revolutionary state had achieved, as opposed to its enemies that were still hoping to fight the old way to prevent essentially the extension of rights to a greater pool of subjects. That would have naturally triggered, and as it would happen later on in the 19th century, in fact, many political and social change, and including the ones that, were, the concept, as we were saying before, is not necessarily a negative one per se, but, that from the disgregation of this system also totalitarianism emerged, right? And so we are still in front of that risk. We are still to continuously be educated about the incredibly delicate balance that such powerful political systems have to maintain in order not to essentially become dysfunctional. And the history of the 20th century, also from a military point of view, shows that brilliantly. I plan to expand more in contemporary warfare. As you know, in December we talked about the Battle of the Ardennes. I uploaded something about the U-boats and more, because there is really a lot to talk about there, and never think that you can study military history just focusing on an era and kind of ignoring the rest, because otherwise you will never achieve any kind of expertise and proficiency in that discipline. So given this sketchy introduction, we are also making a sketch video here because you understand that the topic is huge and we should deal with that also in much more depth, as far, especially in fact the theoretical side of the story is concerned. That's what the Von Kriege series is concerned with. There would be a lot to talk about Jomini. We will briefly mention him now for obvious reasons. So, as we've seen, we can start just from infantry, right? At some point, we will properly make a video about the Napoleonic battle experience, right? What it really meant to be there, both perspectively and kind of more essentially, right? But it's obvious at this point, infantry is the decisive arm historically from modern times, and every single infantry unit, so the base fundamentally of these armies, could be deployed given this dramatic level of training and uniformity according to the need of the moment on the battlefield, in line, in column, or in square, right? And this depended mainly and respectively on, for creating firepower in the most kind of doctrinally efficient way of the time. The battlefields are still full at this point. You have to have this thickly compact line of infantrymen to concentrate the adequate volume of fire against the opponent. The column, it was essentially used for speeding up the march, because it's easier fundamentally to make an army maintaining its a unit maintaining its cohesion when simply the guy behind you has to follow you, and the front is narrower, right? Which in line formation said when the advance comes is more difficult to maintain intact, and so deploying rapidly. The French in this had also, well, actually from quite a while, like a superior tradition, properly of speedier step, right, compared to other countries. But this aforementioned need of injecting reserves continuously on the battlefield and doing it quickly and orderly, etc., was something that during the French Revolutionary Wars had been played with a lot by the French army. And the square, that is the best formation, especially to adopt against cavalry charges, because not just there is naturally again an infantry superiority over cavalry due to firepower and also to bayonets, but especially here you have a unit that has a front all around its perimeter. Cavalry would not outflank the unit to its detriment, but if it wants to achieve anything, will have to try just to shatter the square in a way or another, hopefully combine arms with artillery and infantry that usually when they operate all three at once are unstoppable. But generally speaking, the infantry square just is extremely tough to break, and especially cavalry doesn't quite stand much of a chance against that. Horses, in theory, can even charge into it, but it's not easy to make them actually do it in that condition unless this square is already pretty shattered. And in many ways, it's the same concept with infantry, also deployed in line specifically. Now, the crucial decision to switch from one formation to another, or the ones just illustrated, was made in moments by battalion or regiment commanders over and over again during a day's battle, because these infantry units were meant to be that flexible in that system. You constantly needed to redeploy them, to inject them somewhere, to cope with the unforeseen. Right, we have seen what a mess the battlefield of Austerlitz really was. You often don't have the palest idea what is happening all around, so the best way, even to save your skin on some occasion, is literally to literally rests on the capacity to switch formation in this regard. There was, for example, if I'm not wrong, a Saxon battalion that of the Prussian army that managed to retreat in square formation, because yes, square could also move, right? In fact, withdrawing from the battlefield there and saving itself, fencing off cavalry attacks, even after the disaster at Jena Auerstedt, which is quite meaningful of the flexibility of the infantry, and so also the general problem posed by such tactical formulas. Now, the consequence of such flexibility was that the individual detachments, again, had greater tactical autonomy than it had been the case before. Again, as we've seen during the Ancien regime, mostly you have literally a single army array, right? So there is an infantry line, can be huge, it can stretch for kilometers, but you have, generally speaking, that line, and then the wings, and then the artillery interspersed, and then you have the reserves. But essentially, you have that single array, right? Now, these formations can kind of really change the system is much larger, right? So the battlefield also gets more messy by a degree, and so every unit has to intervene in a fashion that such officers see fit, right, to the situation, to that specific moment of emergency that can really make the difference between life and death. And the generals themselves gave up deploying the entire army in a single linear formation anymore to be maneuvered, as the Ancien Regime military theorists had considered, in a geometric fashion, like a perfect mechanism. In this sense, as we were saying before, it's important to look at also the era, the politics of it all. The Ancien Regime is the actual civilization that made the modern state. They made it themselves. It's the absolute sovereigns that actually began to create a state that is the same one that eventually would rebel against them because of this trigger soil consisting in having too much power concentrated in fewer hands, to the point that the rest of the mass, also thanks to the same subtle development carried out by the absolute monarchs, had grown richer, more powerful, specifically the bourgeoisie, and that thus wanted to extend even properly the military participation, right? Of course, in a political sense, because there is a connection between the exercise of violence and naturally political, rights in general. And I just re-uploaded recently a video about the French officers' appointment and the struggle that was occurring, in fact, in France before the revolution between the aristocracy that also was significantly segmented within itself, right? The actual backbone of the French army before the revolution was the humble, low aristocracy that was actually quite good at that job, and that, however, received the hatred of the bourgeoisie for being aristocrats in the first place, and in other issues. In any case, this geometric idea was taking place during the Enlightenment. Essentially had been conceiving the battle as an essentially rational event, right? And could it thus be planned according to it, and conducted almost at a table, right? Imposing one's will on the adversaries thanks to the mechanical discipline of the troops, right? this concept is still alive during the Napoleonic era. Think about, in fact, the work of Jomini, that remained, in this sense, an opponent of von Clausewitz, at least until he was alive. Then Jomini was a very intelligent man, and also a pretty honest one, who finally admitted, he lived way after the Napoleonic Wars, that von Clausewitz instead was right about the fact that the concept of internal lines, and so this geometrical idea that you can simply treat the battlefield as, now I will create this corner, this chamber of fire, that there is all a kind of a mathematical certainty to how things will actually go, just if you stick to that geometric deterministic principle, was wrong, right? However, one must also understand how this thing had come about, because obviously there is a geometric dimension also in warfare, in the lines of fire and all, so that in the numbers even. So that does exist, but it's not the deal. It's not a decisive one. And we could digress on why this idea had come about in general, because it's fundamentally an over-reliance on almost a positivistic, in fact, mentality before the full 19th century that is often misunderstood, because it's not a fault of, say, the cult of reason, or even just rationalism per se, because also tradition says that basically, if you had a pure reason, so a full knowledge, you would also act upon it. Von Clausewitz explains this in the section where he describes the various psychological profiles that would at least predispose a good commander, military mind. But it has rather to do with essentially the lack of interest towards the spiritual dimension of the battlefield, and so actually not even just an abstract, but a merely material side of the story, right? So if you reduce warfare to numbers, to again just number of troops, pretending that they're all alike and that the only thing that is going to make the difference on the battlefield is which angle you practically deploy them, and all what can come from that, which by itself would be also an extremely complex system to resolve mathematically, and de facto, in fact, impossibly so. And that's why also von Clausewitz comes on the fore with the prevalence, of course, of the moral dimension of warfare. That, however, you again must at least understand as a bias from the system which these armies were coming from. Naturally, war was always played in a very dirty way. So the picture of, 18th century warfare with lace and wigs and exchange of gallantries such as, please shoot first. No, I let you shoot first, which actually is not really what it seems, right? Even in gallantry terms, because again, there is always a reason why that was happening in a strictly military sense that made the effect, right? Actually, there was some advantage at the beginning to make the enemy shoot first, but I will not deal with this in this video. In any case, it's a very complicated issue. It's not even just about that, of course, but it's really not there. Right, we have, in fact, this geometric rationalistic idea of the 18th century. It was really not there, right? There were some armies that doctrinally were fixated with this idea of precision, of discipline, whatever, but like in the Prussian army, right, that, pick the 7 years war, like 70% of the Prussian officers died in that battle, which triggered also dramatic political mechanisms, because basically the Junker were decimated, and the Prussian state could even step further in levels of centralization. But there is a moral point to that, right? The fact that even under fire of an enemy that, you could simply reach quicker, as you could overwhelm him just with numbers because you had that advantage momentarily. The officers would impose every single man to just march at the same damn single pace, de facto getting themselves killed, just not to ever break the formation in that fashion is it's not just a romantic idea. It was about this idea of temper, complete teaching properly the contempt towards death as such, that made more than all the geometry of it, right? Actually, in that case, as you understood, it would even cause unnecessary casualties in your own ranks. But of course, 18th century battlefields were much more messy than they're usually depicted. Units broke formation continuously. The chaos ensued. There were lots of, kind of back and forth, and we will talk about that experience too. However, it was, especially in Europe, so where there was essentially a conventional warfare due to the level of development of the states, the fact basically in Europe everybody fought in the same identical way, that was also at that point, with the Enlightenment, with scientific advancement, like booming, like it was an extremely homogeneous culture. You would have naturally all these states all these monarchies, let's say better, because that was the point, trying to knock each other out. So the thing was still seen as an aristocratic sport of some sort. It was that dynasty that, because of its greatness, was followed by subjects that could count on those armies on the field and so on. But there was such a deep homogeneity there, and also a relatively contained amount of troops brought on the field, in spite of the enormous costs, but still, again, on that base for which the monarchs didn't want to arm too many people, because they could, in fact, make a revolution at some point, had brought to the idea that doctrine, like especially tactics, was a sort of self-contained dimension where you could play just on that board and more or less, facing always the same enemy, and so with a very low level of asymmetry, no doubt, but war is always asymmetric by definition, and thus giving the illusion, perspectively, that since these European armies were kind of all alike and they fought more or less with the same numbers, as it was a similar level of development also properly in the availability of resources and so on, you could just concentrate, narrow down, kind of, alienate yourself on the base of geometric lines on the battlefield. What happens with the French Revolution is this thing gets fucked up completely, because you have basically France literally exploding with its brutal amount of people and resources, and that are now all armed together by a single state that plus says, let's simply behead any kind of aristocrat that tries to impose us, again, a dynastic principle. And naturally, all the ideological implications of this, and so really everybody going at war against each other. There is not like really, it's just France's fault or the other, or basically all the rest of Europe's fault from the other side. They were simply struggling for, like before. Now, just France had a different system, a more dangerous one, but that was also the fruit of the time, and actually of the single most developed continental power that had, in fact, increased dramatically its own state exactly through the moment of the so-called absolutism, and that now could threaten the entire continent with the sheer amount of quantity of quality of troops, really, because that's the important thing, and plus spreading these seeds of revolution, of subversion of the established order, and so on, that still lead in the other countries, which meant what exactly? That, first of all, again, the French began to field armies of hundreds of thousands of men, plus with an unprecedented level of discipline, cohesion, training, etc., that the other countries had not had a revolution to match, and that would, in the moment, France basically conquered them. I mean, that's the entire point of von Clausewitz, Prussia, all these systems eventually having to copy the Napoleonic one, because they had been battered and defeated by the same. And so opening to a phase, but if you read Hegel's, the description of the entrance of Napoleon in Vienna in 1806, literally showed the spirit of the war passing through the Corsican, So much so that after the victories of the Austerlitz campaign, even the same, one of the most radically, in fact, reactionary, ultra-absolutistic regimes like the Tsarist one literally told Napoleon that he was a man sent by God. Reflect on that, because again, I just recently made a video about that from a political point of view. It's I think, I don't remember, balancing tradition and modernity. It was, I don't remember what the main title was, but you remember that because it got a lot of views, and showing effectively the degree of power that all the great absolute monarchs had been seeking, and that now was being in fact owned by somebody that evidently was, yes, ideologically adverse, but still had gotten a substantial amount of things right to achieve what it achieved. And even though France was eventually brought back within its own boundaries with the restoration and everything, still Europe was changed forever, right? And the death of that system would arrive in 1918, 1919 at the latest, but the Napoleonic Wars had changed everything for good, for all. So the point being what? That those geometric armies, these contained armies that had fundamentally just increased in quality over just because of many also technological development, etc. For example, the artillery mobility, things like these throughout the 18th century, right? At the beginning of the century, of course, with the War of Spanish Succession, Europeans had already tried to create huge armies they were already in the hundreds of thousands at that time, whether it were French or coalition forces, because, the countries involved were practically the same. But the thing was so messy that they couldn't properly handle it. It cost too much, and so they basically all doctrinally shrank the numerical size of the armies, and trying to increment instead the quality of it right now. So it doesn't matter how qualitative these armies had arrived to be at the end of the 18th century. Now we have, again, I think that changes all, because what truly matters here is, first of all, also how many men you can field, because France is going to field a huge amount, and very often will actually fight against in numerical inferiority, because it's literally all the rest of Europe most of the time that has more men together. We've seen it in those videos. But the problem is exactly this. It's not a matter of how you change the infantry line angle on the battlefield. It's a matter of literally how many hundreds of thousands of men you have to levy politically, training them, arming, equipping them, supplying them, and sustaining the cost of that, because warfare, of course, doesn't end on the battlefield. I mean, as we will see now, even the much more gradual, let's say, attrition now happening on the battlefields, at least for the armies as a whole, in relative terms, still can make decisive outcomes, because these armies are so big that once you have basically made them fight, and you have seen was superior, well, the weaker system is going practically to melt away. I mean, it's decided, right? You can hope, of course, strategically things can get very, very unpredictable, but generally speaking, you can understand just macroscopically from which side, the thing is going to, the favor is going to swing. And this would literally make the freedom of a country or another in the process. And that's how the French conquered practically all of Europe throughout these years. So the point here was not just, again, the mere cost. It was in a material sense, but also the moral one. It is how much would be your state willing to spend this huge amount of human and material resources in order to to stop France, the revolutionary ideas, and so on, right? That becomes a hard wrestling, right? That takes in consideration again the sheer cost that the thing imposes you. I mean, France here literally boomed because it was dramatically motivated by the opportunity of essentially maintaining a more liberal system that it had had before. So France was moved not by the dictatorial will of Napoleon, it was moved by the French people, right, in a way or another, and whoever they were, and still, it was naturally a dramatic social segmentation, there was still de facto an aristocracy, so it's, again, the same countries evolving over time. But the thing is literally, and more evidently, a matter of clash of wills, right? Because in absolute times, in the time of the Ancien Regime, fundamentally the idea was that it's the sovereign who decides about these things, right? God has entrusted him with this task. The sovereign technically should be still, on the base of this, accepted by subjects, and during the wars of the 18th century, it had become evident that statal matters had become ever more important, and that thus the sovereigns themselves and their institution, the royal family, and all these things were becoming smaller in comparison to the bigger picture. However, now, nobody in fact could deny that there were massive forces being unchained from this national spirits that were becoming surely more radical, more extremistic, but in this sense still provided with a force, with a motivation, with something that, this thing goes up and down, because we still live in the nation states, but let's say the degree by which you may be motivated in order to fight a war changes dramatically. At the time, people had pretty more kind of very stringent reasons to fight, not because they were necessarily more intelligent as masses, but because it was much more evident what they were going to lose in the process if they wouldn't, right? So today you may even be losing an enormous much, but still, you have enough comparatively say, well, yeah, but I kind of don't want to because I don't understand what's going on. You don't mind, and you will simply grow weaker in the process because you're dumb. And it's only when you will be with somebody with stepping with the boot on your hand that you will be willing to pick a gun and starting shooting people, which is what happens pretty easily, actually, in any country under, the given circumstance. So what happened in Napoleonic times, and this is the most beautiful painting that von Clausewitz has drawn for us, and that, in fact, today we will partly also quote, a conception in which it's easier also to recognize ourselves today, after all, which takes into account complexity, frictions, chance, of course, and considers victory more as the accumulation of small secondary effects cleverly provoked and exploited by an attentive commander than as the flawless demonstration of a theorem. And von Clausewitz definitely criticized Jomini's view in this regard, saying that, of course, it is a great part of the von Krieg deals with the principle of internal lines, because it's obvious. I mean, I think the last chapter we made was about river crossing, and there are literally mathematical proportions you have to take in consideration, but these are still secondary compared to morale. And properly, what is pushing this whole thing, and that is not a military problem, it's primarily a political problem, right? And this, of course, von Clausewitz does not address, because von Clausewitz doesn't talk politics in the von Krieg, if not as much as, war is just a continuation of politics with other means. But of course he says you may, here we describe what war is in general, how it works. Then you may have all the reasons you want to fight a war, and that's history. We're not dealing with it here. But this is a man who joined the Prussian army since the war of the First Coalition at 12 years old, right? And essentially remained a general throughout all the Napoleonic Wars and beyond, until his death in the 30s of the 19th century. And that is, of course, quite meaningful, because it's actually a very clean work from a person that literally stepped in the guts and the mud and for most of his life, and perfectly new, and renders actually some of the most beautifully moving pictures of that sometimes, because in this kind of cold, logical, rationalistic but still idealistic Prussian mentality, you have still every once in a while these phrases such as who has not been there cannot understand what it is for real. And yet he has this faith, this trust, this true conviction that you can understand warfare in spite of the fact that mathematically our brains cannot sort it out. There is no way to, create any artificial intelligence that does this. We cannot predict warfare. Warfare is the activity with the, the greatest, essentially, political implications. It's the most consequential event in time and space, fundamentally. That is the most complex, also unpredictably so, exactly because of that reason, that we can have a control of. Right? In other words, yes, there are much bigger things that happen in civilizational history, but they happen over millennia or centuries, and you can't even quite picture what they are. While an army is literally, an organized force commanded by a state, by a hierarchy, composed by actual people. So you are actually doing the thing. It's not an abstract, kind of emotionalistic, random stuff that is going on. You still do have a control on it, and even if the whole thing is by degree unpredictable, because the situation changes continuously, also because of the laws of reciprocity, because you're not fighting against a computer, you're fighting against other human beings. Of course, the experience that you can mature through the knowledge of direct command and or military history is the one that can have a positive influence on the outcome for you about war. And this is basically the entire reason why history itself is the same as far as politics and society is concerned. And this is the brilliant intuition of the Clausewitzian genius, right? So there is, naturally I will not praise von Clausewitz further, because I have a huge series about him, and which I hope to be coming to conclude also some other time in the future. But as long as I can make this history videos, I'll stick to them, because you simply watch that series less, unfortunately, even though it's the single most important of the channel. But people like pictures like children, and so you have to content them some way. So the philosophical turn implicit in this new approach to battle, that naturally was not just von Clausewitz, because it was just appearing as such, but that was perfectly theorized by him, is evident exactly, in fact, in his work, in when he's describing how, for example, 18th century generals had been approaching this kind of realization, right? And when you study, you see that we analyzed the thought of other military thinkers like Montecuccoli, for example. We have seen, and these were the most important, like between, the greatest military thinkers in this sense were Machiavelli, Montecuccoli, and von Clausewitz, right? In Western civilization, in world civilization in the first place, in that chronological timeline. And after von Clausewitz, nobody ever managed to say anything more about war, right? They just try to shit everything because they don't understand war themselves. But essentially any person who studied, that tried to create an alternative theory to von Clausewitz is just a charlatan. And yes, I'm talking even about people who teach in military academies, at least some of them. I'm making actually very specific reference, if you understand what I mean, but, aside some thieves and charlatans like Little Hart, but literally there has been a 20th century hype in saying we have to understand how warfare is different. Because why? Because von Clausewitz is from the 19th century. These people have not literally even read von Clausewitz. Because, of course, he doesn't describe war. Say, he makes an example of it by the moment of greatest development that helps to understand the same art of war by what he had seen. It was, in fact, the biggest thing ever happening in mankind in his own lifetime, with the Napoleonic Wars, but it has nothing to do with 19th century warfare per se, nor it doesn't understand and people fixate with certain kind of categorical definitions, because again, the Enlightenment, unfortunately, in its negative part, has left us with this rigid categorism that if you have even, again, studied von Clausewitz, you know how impossibly you can interpret the work through, because literally von Clausewitz says different things that just appear to be different about the same thing. And if you don't notice that, it's because you don't have the depth of what he's talking about, the context of what he's talking about, the references he's talking about. It's an incredibly complex system at the same level of development of, the philosophical and scientific works of Kant and Hegel, that in fact he's also, massively influenced by, just in that Prussian background, of course. And a background that had suffered, in fact, the defeat at the hands of the French, the occupation of the country, and so eventually the liberation through a completely different model that is also the Prussian armored forces, that is the one of Scharnhorst and the same Clausewitz, and that also brought 30 years later to the German unification. Now, it's not, of course, time to digress on these topics, but we still have to make lots of videos to properly explain, especially 19th century military theory, because that is really what we're living in, and it's as if we were just children. We got more youngly stupid in the meanwhile, but we just had our father's gun without knowing how to even operate it nowadays, right? Having had it at least from the 19th century so beautifully presented to us by Karl von Clausewitz. And I will simply quote a passage of the Von Kriege that we already came across, describing essentially the character of a great battle in the Napoleonic era. So von Clausewitz says, "What does a great battle generally consist of today? Large masses line up quietly side by side and in depth. Only a relatively small fraction of the whole is explained, and this is left to exhaust itself in a struggle which consists of a firefight lasting several hours, interspersed and made somewhat animated on both sides by partial assaults, bayonet attacks, and cavalry charges. When this aliquot has gradually exhausted its energies and there are only leftovers of too little performance left, it is withdrawn and replaced with another. Thus the battle proceeds with a moderate destructive intensity, similar to burning moist dust. And when the darkness of the night forces us to cease the fight, because neither of the two parties has sufficient sight and therefore does not want to rely blindly on chance, then we evaluate how much remains for both of us of still usable masses. That is, they have not yet fallen upon themselves like volcanoes whose eruptive force has run out. It also evaluates how much ground has been gained or lost, and the security conditions behind it. These isolated results will be added to the isolated impressions of bravery or fear, of sagacity or incapacity, which have been believed to be noticed, both in our troops and in the enemy during the fight. And the result is an overall impression which gives rise to the decision to abandon the battlefield or to restart the fight the following morning." Now this is a beautifully, also just evocative, plastic, visual picture that von Clausewitz always, with his brilliant prose is able to render. Right, so you understand the mechanism here. You have these large masses lining up quietly, side by side and in depth, right? So just preparing all the stuff you could pour in, right? And in fact, only a relatively small fraction of this is basically engaged at a given time, thus being left to exhaust itself in a struggle which consists of this firefight lasting several hours, right? So the divisional clash that we were talking about before, and what is going on there is that, essentially the battle line exchanges musketry fire and artillery harasses the enemy lines. Always remember, it's musketry fire that kills the most. Artillery paradoxically doesn't, even though it can create horrendous gaps within formations with enfilade fire, dozens of people literally, blowing up, with limbs scattered everywhere, by the sheer impact of the ball. But overall, there is just this very gradual burning. It's as if you were inserting coal into an oven, and this clash went on, by keeping to inject coal, and between the two sides, the one that is able to keep up the fire for longer, for the longest time, is gonna essentially emerge victorious from this. And this engagement is going to be animated, as von Clausewitz says, on both sides. So these are large masses fighting, right? Even the divisions are talking about, of course, thousands of men, and they carry out partial assaults, bayonet attacks, especially when the musketry ammo is ended, right? And there is a few, just like a 2% of all the wounds deriving from bayonet charges, but they do exist, right? It's very often, the only sign of a unit after such bloody engagement still having the moral strength to mount bayonets is enough to crack the morale from the other side. But again, this may happen for a battalion, this is not going to break the entire formation, because there are so many reserves that this is just, again, alternating them and see what happens overall. There are cavalry charges as well, when the infantry units are wavering. You know how to surprise them. Again, the optimal thing is to combine all the three arms, artillery, cavalry, and infantry, because that makes the greatest effect. You're not always sure, of course, how the thing is going to turn out, because you don't know, how many other enemies there are, how much you can within your same, reserve to use reserves, and so on. So this section of the army gradually exhausts its energies. Basically, even when it's, it's still maybe it has a numerical advantage, but it's exhausted. Even a smaller force of fresh reserves can wipe it out. Right? So to avoid this, of course, the unit is withdrawn, is replaced by another. The same goes from the other side. Right? If you can still stand their ground and pour fire on the enemy, they just wait for it to be exhausted. And then you want to preserve the unit just per se. Right? So it may happen it gets wiped out because, an entire cuirassier unit kind of, cuts them down like grass. But, of course, this thing, again, goes on very, very gradually. Thus, there are ups and downs. So there are moments in which the battle is more heated. The problem naturally is channeling adequately all these energies. It's somewhere where it can make the most desired effect. So at the beginning of the battle, also there are more forces involved. You are kind of more freaky in a way. At the end of the battle, you just are perhaps even more freaky because you have to spot the right moment where to send reserves and all this stuff. But generally speaking, the clash evolves over time. There is a peak and then a decline. So night, at the time, since ever before and still today, in spite of our infrared vision, satellitary images, and so on, brings an unavoidable halt of most of the operations, right? Especially on a large scale, because for that you really need a concrete vision of battlefield. You have to be on the ground to understand it to the fullest. So you can't take decisions from there in the same way you would do during the day. Plus, you're probably exhausted yourself. You have to sleep at some point in all this mess, which can affect your entire kind of leadership capacity at that point. Even if you're an excellent general, but if you don't sleep enough, you can do pretty bad stuff with your troops. So this is also the moment that we were describing before, when, let's say, the main engagement, at least for the day, is over. Right? Naturally, at night there are going to be things like raids, assaults, skirmishes, things of this kind, but they're less consequential. The bigger forces are somewhere else, right? So there may be significant tactical, strategic outcomes from there, but not as much as there would be during the day. And if at that point, and naturally what happened during the day is known, and that's where the thing comes, right? What do we do tomorrow after this? Because imagine you have had your share of dead, of wounded. You have properly to recollect all this, like you have to be informed by all the possible available data, not just of the casualties per se, but also what is, in fact, Clausewitz now describes it, like what is the impression that you got from the field, right? And this thing can vary dramatically, because it's obvious that if you speak to, I don't know, one of the most battered units, you say it's hellish, the enemy is so strong, we can't hold them. According to me, they're more motivated. They are pushing, or somebody else maybe in the same unit thinks, that's why the role of the commander in chief is crucial there. That says, no, it's just an impression. They're tired as much as we are, and so what do we do? Do we take the chance tomorrow to fight again? Whatever. So, on the base of all this, naturally, as you understood during the day, even a major engagement, like there are, Austerlitz, as we saw it, at the end of the day was decided. The coalition army was practically destroyed. There were some units that kind of retreated intact from the field, also from the losing side, whatever. But there are other circumstances in which things are less clear, right? So this depends on the battle. And consider again that, strategically speaking, the battlefield here is naturally the place where combat is taking place. But when you mobilize hundreds of thousands of men, these are scattered all over kind of an entire region of Europe, right? From, say, the Baltic to the Alps. So there is always a very composite nature of also the forces engaged, whatever. That there are sieges, there are raids, skirmishes, all this kind of stuff. So there isn't just a big battle, but the big battle is the most strategically consequential, and that's the one you should be hoping for, especially if you are the one with the greatest advantage and you want to get it over with, because every day spent again with such huge forces on the field is also another hugely costly day for your statal economy, for the capacity just even justifying what you're doing, whatever, and also a moment in which your forces are wearing themselves down, because you cannot keep a single army forever on the field, right? You need alternation, you need campaigns to end, like mostly at this point in history there is still some degree of, let's say, not entirely, right? The Napoleonic Wars are a good example of that, but an important degree of seasonalism, right? We've seen it also how this dictated some aspects of the Battle of Austerlitz, for example, the necessity still coming back to winter position. So there is a pressure to get it over with, and again, if you have literally hundreds of thousands of men that are confronting each other on a battlefield that can see combat for multiple days, there's going to be such an attrition that at the end of the day is going to tilt the balance in favor of one of the two sides, right? So you have to take into account was fought, was not, and how much, for example, here from Clausewitz has listed it, how many ground has been gained or lost, which just per se is not necessarily the whole picture, right? Actually, we've seen how the enemy could be even attracted at some point in traps. He would fake to be weaker so that the enemy would be able to abandon his position, coming into your trap, in fact. What are the security conditions behind it? Like, if there is an enemy army that is approaching, is going to cut your supply lines, how much are you going to gamble further? Especially think about the communications of the time. You've seen all these coalition wars that were incredibly complicated. Every country had its own political motives, more or less reasons to fight, or even wanting, let's say, a part of the Allied to be destroyed on the battlefield so that they would rise to greater importance in Europe. We have seen how Prussia, for example, didn't intervene in time at Austerlitz, and this, of course, dramatically influenced Napoleon's strategy. And the outcome of that would be the following year, again, Prussia being conquered itself. So it's all extremely difficult to handle in the first place. And what happens on the battlefield, in that sense, is critical, because in many ways your strategic objective is the one of, von Clausewitz explains this in the Infantry, to effectively destroy the enemy forces, right? The objective of war, politically speaking, is of course to compel the enemy to fulfill your will through this act of violence. But even though the Schwerpunkt of the enemy may not be just the armed forces per se, right? The Schwerpunkt could even be a place, right? It may have nothing to do with the forces. It's an extremely it can be an extremely volatile thing, right? Constantly changing, and they will have to make, in fact, given the title of this channel, probably a series explaining the Schwerpunkt that people tend to get wrong kind of all the time. Some people think that the Schwerpunkt is the strongest point of view. It can be, but it's not necessarily that. The concept is that the more you run out of forces, generally speaking, however, literally the strategic goal is accomplished. So let's say that the objective tends to overlap with the slaughter of the enemy forces. Because without that, you have nothing upon which to act violently, right? And so this is true for your forces as well, right? So von Clausewitz tells us how it goes, because you have essentially to, especially as the commander-in-chief, to receive the impression of so many different people, some of which are freaking out, some of which are traumatized, some of which are exalted, some of which want to convince you, but primarily also maybe themselves, that something is the way it is rather than another. There are different characters, some people you like, some you don't like, some they don't like each other. You have contradictory information. Again, you don't have the communication systems we have today, so you are, first of all, morally speaking, overwhelmed by this, right? All the moral responsibility of what is going on rests on the shoulders of the commander-in-chief, against the fourth estate or delusion that basically generals are just a bunch of alienated people from high society that don't care anything about the soldiers. And this is unfortunately what nationalism and socialism has left us nowadays, with the lesser people thinking to have anything to do with understanding war. And that's unfortunately, how more war happens as a consequence. And at least fortunately, in part, these people get slaughtered in the process, which seems like a pretty, at least a pretty fair consequence. Except they're going to blame it on somebody else, while the fault is always, and in any case exclusively and totally, of the people and nobody else but the people entirely for anything political and war completely. But here you're pressured mentally to the extremes, right? Only megalopsychic people can be commanders-in-chief in certain situations, and they must have a very specific mindset that it has nothing to do with being a street thug who thinks like, I don't know, that carrying out, making HEMA, and so deluding themselves that has anything to do with anything military in the first place, in a historical or just contemporary sense, is unfortunately, again, extremely distant from the masses' understanding of any kind of war. It has to take an extremely developed and incredibly powerful mind, an incredibly intelligent, again, intuitive person, and determined person, and literally knowledgeable person, and courageous person, and lots of other qualities that definitely the average person does not have, and it cannot be created just out of scratch. All these weights to determine, whether these isolated impressions gathered from this quite big bucket are objective or not. I mean, the degree of their objectivity and subjectivity, right? When you, for example, have there can be moral effects even of same military engagements that kind of more or less and in an unequivocal way that can have very different moral impacts on, politically speaking. It can even affect the war to the point that they're going to quit it beforehand, even in conditions of advantage. So again, people are crazy by many indicators. In any case, here we're in principle to judge merely the military side of the story. So with this episode of bravery or fear, of sagacity, of incapacity, these are all, how do we know that? Like, okay, you've been there on the front line, you've seen that unit behaving that way, but then, right, do you have an overall understanding of also what was happening from the other side? You cannot be in the mind of those people, of the commanders, of why they have been sent there, whether they got wrong in some way. So it's all, the fog of war is real. And it's not a matter of, information per se. It's literally a moral matter, right? It's all very laughable when you see people today that they say, we don't know what is happening on the front line in Ukraine, as if we actually didn't know with a very significant amount of detail, just because you don't dig in the sources of that. And so it takes a long time to do it, but, you can more or less gather information in a way. Think about doing in like while it's going on. So when you have to take decisions immediately, so you need a hell of a processional capacity to analyze this data, to criticize them strategically. Plus, you are dramatically invested from a moral point of view. You're not just here, looking at that from your iPhone, sitting lazily on the sofa eating Cheetos, right? There are people who are dying at the very moment in large numbers because of your choices, right? And this thing weighs on you dramatically, as much as on all the other people who have been commanding those men and that are reporting to you what's going on. And so taking a decision in such a circumstance, while his military historians haven't even began naturally to make their research or to even gather the actual information, and that's a very long-term process that can take generations, if not centuries. The question is, you must still make it work in a way or not. So you have to judge, to express a judgment about this, and following your say your intuition. Von Clausewitz is very very clear about this, because again he has a lot of confidence in reason, right? But also in fate, meaning that of course you can be knowledgeable and intelligent and having coup d'oeil, as he claims that every good commander must have, but by definition in war you know at least let's say at best only 1/4 of what you should know to reasonably take a step in the right direction that you know, right? So there is no other way but to use intuition, and von Clausewitz goes as far as saying that basically, unless something clamorously disastrous is happening and quite directly, as a quite likely cause effect between you and your actions that would make you step back, the best thing once you have started one thing is to go through it, right? And not to get excessively distracted by or convinced by other impressions. That's why you need a very strong mind to do this and to follow your intuitions at the same time, because the hardest moment is exactly the one of the crisis in which you have to maintain the hardest control on the thing, and that can mean effectively turning the tides, morally speaking, and thus winning on the field, right? So in this turbulent night, you must take such decisions, and for the following morning to either abandon the battlefield and therefore essentially admitting you've been defeated, right? Maybe in withdrawing to a more favorable position where you hope, right, to at least now to defend, to carry out some kind of other, the war may not be over, be very far from over, but in the morning, if they're still fighting, it means you still think you can win. Otherwise, you have to just accept that it's not the case, right? And the thing is dramatically gradual and fluid. I mean, it's obvious that, for example, losing ground, generally speaking, doesn't correspond to much of a great success. But the way you lose it and the way you are able to put up with important resistances, even still during the retreat, may actually make strategic significant effects, and or some other times, if you're a great gambler and you're very good at these things, you can literally lure the enemy in a trap and essentially make him do what you want him to do, and causing him, traumatic losses in the process. So between this tactical and strategic kind of comparison of the Napoleonic art of war, like an apparent contrast, right? So we have seen that battles are essentially attritional engagements. Von Clausewitz has told us now that basically it's more about the decision to continue the fight than the actual exhaustion of the entire forces. So what about the idea which attributes to Napoleon the pursuit of the decisive battle at all costs, understood as a battle of annihilation? So something that aims at the destruction of the enemy army, and if possible at the immediate victorious conclusion of the battle, and thus the campaign, right? Well, it's the difference lays exactly in the two dimensions, the tactical and strategic one, that have a joint point, but that are two different things. You can have, as we've seen, tactically speaking, engagements that do not resolve themselves with the complete annihilation of the enemy, but in which you may have inflicted him so many losses that basically the war is won, right? And politically speaking, that the military mean is basically withdrawn, and so politics starts, negotiation starts again, and so on. So the two concepts do not really contrast, right? It is true that Napoleon always tried to achieve the decisive result when conditions allowed him, and the concentration of forces was crucial there, because if you again have such an enormous amount of forces, you have all and you believe to be superior, and or that you're such a tactical genius that you can again, win also in conditions of inferiority, and or managing to pull off a trick on the enemy, you will concentrate your forces to punch as hard as you can, because that's the only thing that strategy gets down to. As von Clausewitz explained, literally the best strategy is to be very strong, right? It may seem obvious and banal, but it's what tendentially gets down to in practice. You may not, if you can't be strong, then you have to resort to other strategies and tactics of some kind of attrition and dispersion, and or you should always be able to oppose, of course, naturally a satisfactory amount of forces to the enemy if you don't want to further give way, right, to the enemy. But you must also be able to do it in the first place, to gather those forces. Otherwise, you wouldn't even fight in the first place. There wouldn't be a war, right? And when you look at Napoleonic warfare, you realize that the conditions to set up this kind of decisive battle were rarely achieved. That is to say, most campaigns just proceeded with a sort of kind of constant attrition, wearing out, etc., simply because the situation was not so, in fact, unbalanced, right? The problem is that when the odds are leveled, you must be necessarily also very, very cautious. So yes, you have to maintain your cohesion. You have to be always ready to strike a decisive blow to the enemy. But at the same time, that's what the enemy, if you keep in close, can do equally at the same time. So naturally, there are more or less pressuring political and strategic situations for which you must do this, right? But in practice, there is also a lot of caution, because what is at stake is enormous. It's literally the future of your country, of your people, and just generally speaking, everything you may have essentially accumulated in a lifetime of a force, and including military ones, right? Several Napoleonic battles were decisive because the armies that faced each other were so powerful, and such was the importance attributed by both sides to the outcome of such battle, that the defeated was persuaded to open for peace negotiation, right? So strategically at that point, that battle became decisive, right? Not always. There are great battles, again, that wouldn't just be it. They would knock out, it would be decisive, say, politically for one country to be practically out, right? Think about the Battle of Ulm. Things could go differently, because not always things, you say, militarily speaking, it could always change the situation, but it becomes more or less likely for it to happen. But say the French march on Vienna, while the rest of the Austrian army had been defeated, basically joined the Russians that had first arrived to engage the French, like in Austria, but then preferred to retreat, right? They wanted to retreat as far as Galicia. They ended up eventually just in Moravia. So you may never know also how decisive that is gonna get until it is decisive. In fact, von Clausewitz says something very eloquent, that is that the only decisive engagement is the last, meaning that it may even be a small engagement, but if still somebody was fighting there, before opening for negotiations politically, like, there was still something that they thought they could be doing, and very often it was the case, because also pieces can be accepted at some point at some costs that are not excessively the greatest, right? And that again depend on the strategy and the politics of the situation and so on. However, when you look at what happened on the battlefield, in most cases these the Napoleonic battles were battles of attrition. Right? They just were fought with this kind of slow burnout of forces, with a very, critical situation till the end. Right? So many 19th century generals would have been fascinated, right, by the Napoleonic myth of the battle of annihilation, right, the Entscheidungsschlacht. But in reality, Napoleonic combat, as described by Clausewitz, rather constitutes a term of comparison, albeit on a smaller scale, for the battles of attrition that dominated the 20th century, right, and even today, as you can see. So if not even for the modern battle of materiel, right, which is won thanks to the greater weight of armament and stocks rather than thanks to maneuver, right, you can appreciate how, is always the most decisive clash is always also the most balanced, and thus, in terms of odds, and thus it can resort to a kind of more immediate solution. However, it also tends to spend itself as far as the political cost of the military instrument is possible, right? In the first place. So naturally, war is fought in different ways, different time, but let's say there's not a materialistic mechanism that make things go the way they do. It's always about the actual commitment of forces that are going to include everything, man, material, and all, principally the moral forces that are necessary to mobilize them in the first place, in order to punch and break, right? If you don't have that, the cost is enormous, right? So it's not really a matter of that now we will do it, right? A bunch of idiots that think that, I don't know, a country can simply invade another, and it's just it will end quickly. I mean, it's just not just even the lack of any trace of strategic education, but properly the complete lack of interest in any kind of political consideration, because you cannot understand war if you don't understand the politics of it. And that's why, again, most people live just in a fantasy world that has nothing to do, of course, with the reality, and these are the people who are becoming the weakest, and in fact that cannot accomplish anything from a military point of view, even when as a culture, as a country, as a people, they're brought to do that, right? So this is a huge deal, and even starting, say, from understanding one of the most critical moments in the Western, let's say, in the world art of war, like the Napoleonic Wars, is, I think, very very useful, right? And it can really show a lot. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.